Hopefully this YAML stuff is starting to make a little bit of sense, and this is where we learn how to create essentially this YAML from scratch. Because when I started learning the Kubernetes YAML format, I first started off just using documentation examples, right, from their docs on the kubernetes.io site or maybe from other places. But the thing about other places is just like Docker, is those blogs and other stuff, they all get outdated. And the thing about Kubernetes is some of these things have changed over time, especially when it comes to things like deployments and pods and other core stuff. They've tweaked their formats, the versions in the API have changed. So we want to stay on the current stuff, which means you need to know how to start from scratch and how do you know when your files need to change rather than just going and rereading the documentation randomly to see if anything's changed, right? So this part is, I think, a skill that it took me a while to figure this stuff out and how to build a file without using some sort of pre-existing template. And we talked about the 4 types in the last lecture. And that root key of kind, which is the resource type, is what I want to focus on first, because you can get a list of those in a cluster. And in our setup test clusters, most of these will be the same between all of us. But as you get into production and you start adding third-party stuff to your cluster, this list will get longer depending on what you're using, because third-party tools can add new resource objects to the API. So let's do a kubectl API resources. And you'll get back at least dozens of different objects that we could scroll through and talk about for hours. We're not going to do that. We've already talked about a few of them, like deployments and pods and replica sets and services. Those are the standard out-of-the-box things. And a lot of the rest of this you may never touch. That's the thing about Kubernetes, is there's just so much to it that you may never actually need all the power from it. So it's not that important that you go through and memorize all of these. But you'll notice this kind column over on the right, and that's what goes in our YAML file. So if we want to create a pod, you can see that there's a kind pod here. If we want to create a deployment, there is a kind called deployment. And you'll also see the API group. That API group is related to the API version, and you'll see that in a second. So this doesn't exactly give us a prescriptive manual necessarily, but if I was sitting here and I said, I need to create a pod, I would look through this list for pods in the type of resources. I would see the kind that it is, so that's what I know I need to put in my YAML. And I would see if there's any API group, because that's going to tell me where to find the versions that I can use, because you probably have seen different documentation for, let's say, a deployment, because the deployments had multiple versions over time. There was a V1 beta 1, like a V1 beta 2, and it's actually even moved around in the API because there's old stuff and new stuff. So it can be a little confusing. If you look at this list, you'll actually find that there are deployments up here and there are deployments down here. And the only difference between the two is this middle row, the API group. That API group is where in the API this type of resource can be accessed, created, deleted, etc. And this gets a little bit into the weeds, but once you start working with this stuff, you're going to have to spend a little bit of time when you see cases like seeing 2 types of deployments here. Which one do I use? Well, you start to go and do research, and you'll find either in the documentation or in the API guide itself, which we'll look at in a little bit, you'll see that stuff where it'll tell you one's deprecated and one is moving to another one. And in this case, with deployments, the new version of it in the latest version is the apps API. So the next command that goes along with that to help us get a better picture of kind plus API version is the kubectl API versions command. And that gives us a shorter list, which is just the different versions of APIs that we need to worry about. And in the case of deployments, you'll see on here that there's something familiar. Remember, we saw that there was an apps one and there was an extensions one for deployments? Well, you'll see those show up here. Technically, there's the extensions V1 beta 1 API, and there is the apps API, of which you can see 3 different versions there. Now, you probably would want to use the V1 apps, not the older betas, but you can see where the API is sort of holding on to deprecated versions of this API as it rolls out new ones. That way, basically, your old YAML isn't broke until many versions go by and they pull stuff out of the API once it's no longer needed. So what typically happens over the lifetime of your YAML, if you were on the early days of Kubernetes, is you might have been using a YAML file that said extensions /v1 beta 1 for the API version, and the kind was deployments. But as that API has changed and they're now calling it the apps API and the version is different, you would still have kind of deployment, but you would change that API version to be apps/v1 now. Now, the way I know that is because I had to do searching, and you look at the documentation, you see it in the examples that, oh, hey, it says apps now. It doesn't say extensions anymore. That's weird. Let me go look it up. And then you find some Kubernetes issues in GitHub that talk about it. It's a little messy. There's not always a clear deprecation list of everything that's changing all the time, so it can be something that is a problem. The way that you'll know that this doesn't work is when you take an old YAML and you apply it to a new cluster, and it will tell you, I don't support this API version anymore, or I don't know what this kind is. And so it'll give you nice errors that let you know that, hey, that's the problem. Then you can probably do some quick searching and find out what's outdated. And so the point here I'm making is that the kind plus the API version are used together to decide which resource you're going to get and which API version you're going to be able to use for that resource. And those are the first two things you need to figure out before you even create a YAML. Once you have that, then you're going to create the metadata part, and the only thing you have to have there is the name of the resource you're going to create. So just give it a nice name, and then you're going to go to the spec. And that's where all of the action is at, because the spec is going to be completely different based on the resource you're creating. If you're creating storage versus a deployment, you can imagine how the YAML would be quite different, right? So in the next lecture, we're going to go through some kube control commands to help you explore the API for all the different spec stuff that you can put into your YAML for different resources. So far, we've discussed that the YAML, there's 4 root objects, and we've talked about 3 of them briefly, and now this is all about the spec, the details of what you want it to do, right? We first had the API, so we know what version of the API we're talking to, we know what resource we want to talk to and we're going to mess with, and then we know the name in the metadata, so we've got that. But after that, the spec is a whole world to explore. The first command I want you to learn is simply how to list all the different keys that you can put for a particular resource type. So the first command I need you to learn is the kube control explain, and then the resource type, that's the kind in the YAML, and then -- recursive. This will show you all the different keys that it supports in the YAML file. And just for services, you can see that it comes back with a lot. It's a little bit overwhelming. There's so much in there. And of course, it doesn't tell us what those things do, but this is at least a quick list of all of them. And what this is good for me is when I'm doing my YAML building is if I can't remember exactly the name of that thing, the creation timestamp, is it timestamp creation? Is it plural? Is it singular? So you can just use this as a quick lookup, but this isn't going to tell you what these things do or which ones are required or anything like that. So we can drill down using a slightly different command and get more details. So let's do the kube control explain services again, but this time we're going to use the dot notation to drill down in the YAML. So I'm going to say I only care about the spec. So I'm going to do a dot .spec, and this time I get back just the sub keys of the spec and then a little description about them, and then what type of value they support, right? Whether is it a Boolean, is it a map of objects, stuff like that, right? It's just a nice little reference. This is going to help you from jumping over to documentation. You can avoid that a little bit by looking here, but this can still be a lot, especially when you just want to look for one attribute. So you can keep drilling down that dot notation. If we do spec.type, that is a particular key inside of services YAML that tells us the type of the load balancer. And if you remember this from talking about services earlier in this course, this could be the cluster IP by default. So if you just leave it out, it'll just do the cluster IP or a node port or a load balancer. So that's where you would specify that. And you know that it would have to go underneath spec and then the key of type in your YAML file So in this case, we could just start writing our YAML, right? Because we know that the kind is going to be service. The API version, it says here, is v1 for this type. You can also verify that with the API-versions command like we did earlier. And then you can put in your value. And this lists the working values. So you know that cluster IP is with a capital C and a capital IP, stuff like that, right? Keeps you from going and potentially searching all over the internet. And you never know whether someone's going to be outdated or correct at all. This is how I like to do it. And just to show how far this dot notation can go, if we looked at the deployment spec, because it has subspecs, which is something we haven't talked about, but you can have a resource as a sub object of another resource, in this case, volumes, right, for storing the data. We could have as many volumes as we want inside a deployment, which it would then connect it to the containers. But those are definitely their own resource types, right, a volume. So in this case, we're going to see the spec twice. So if I were to hit enter on this command for deployment.spec, one of the things in there would be template. And so then I could just type template, and then it would list all the different keys that I could put in there. And one of them is spec of the template. So technically we're in the spec of a spec. And then underneath that spec for the template of a pod, because the deployment has its own spec, and then the template for the pods is underneath that spec, and then it has a spec for the containers, and I might have volumes in here. So volumes, and then NFS, because that's a type of volume I can use, and then the server that I'm going to use inside NFS. And here we go. I could get the description and the information about versions. By the way, this is another quirk with Kubernetes, is the documentation on the command line is a little outdated when it comes to versions, which is why I always use the API versions command along with the API resources, because this is the old way to do it before they now have the new apps/v1 for deployments. I just happen to know that because I was exploring why this was this way, and it turns out that they're keeping it this way in the documentation until it's completely deprecated. Anyway, you can see how I would eventually work my way down the pipe with the dot notation. I would just be like deployment, and then I would look at that, and then I would dot spec, and so on and so forth. So that would be how I eventually find the right keys and values to put in my YAML. Now, you can always go use other people's examples, but what you'll probably end up with is you'll start out with some examples from either me or the documentation, and then you'll want to sort of see if you can go from pure vanilla file using my method here, and then you'll end up with your own little resource, right? Your own little copy of all these resource YAMLs. That's your private repository of knowledge, and that'll be what you use in your company. You might even have standards for how you create deployments and standards for how you create services. Maybe they'll have special labels or annotations on them, which we haven't yet talked about, but they'll maybe have special template features. Anyway, there's lots you could do there, but most teams end up with their own defaults in a repo of sorts that they pull from rather than completely typing from scratch, right? We don't do that with Compose, and we certainly aren't going to want to do that with the YAML here in Kubernetes. Now, the last little tip I'll give you here is if you're more on the developer side of things, you will always appreciate the API documentation, which you can get all this same data from. It's just not necessarily in a way that a more operating focused person would understand. I come from both backgrounds, but I can definitely see how the API documentation can be a little intimidating to someone who's not used to reading Swagger and all these other types of documentation for APIs. So here, I'm just going to pick, for example, on the Kubernetes reference for the API under 1.15, so that's versioned. And I can see here on the left a menu of all the workload APIs. So these are going to be most of the things you'll be dealing with. And then there's service APIs. So these things go on top of your workloads, like the services or the ingress, endpoint, stuff like that. Then you have configs and storage down here. And as you go, you'll actually get to more deprecated or legacy API versions. And you could explore whether, you'll see in here like a lot of these alphas and betas. So you can kind of figure out which ones are there. But if I just went up to deployment real quick and came here, I could get some kube control examples of what it might look like. And I could also scroll down here and look for the spec. And the spec of something is where you're going to get all that detail that we were looking at earlier. So underneath the spec, you'll see all these different options for that particular object. Then if I dive into the template of the deployment spec, if you remember from a while ago when I was following the dot notation, that'll go into the pod template, and then we'll jump over here into that, and you'll see all these things jumping into that template and so on and so forth. So it requires you to dig around a little bit to figure out and find the objects and the keys that you're looking for. I find that it's a little bit easier to work from the command line, but the command line also doesn't deal with versions. So if you've got a different version of a client than your server version, you'll want to definitely look at the API docs, because your client might be on an older or newer version than what your server can support. And there's no real way at the command line that I'm aware of to get the different versions of the information. It's always just the version of your client.